This is Democracy Watch. Mark, I want to put something on the screen here that really caught my eye. Core Democratic groups are preparing to be targeted by the Trump administration. This goes on to discuss ways in which Act Blue and Indivisible, again, core Democratic groups that have been around in the zeitgeist for quite a while, that are key to Democratic progress, either fundraising or resistance to this administration, preparing to be targeted. So can you speak on what is occurring right now as it relates to these groups and what it might signal more broadly in terms of what this administration is doing moving forward?
Look, I can't speak to what the Trump administration may be doing with respect to those two organizations, but I can say this. Donald Trump wants to dismantle any institution that stands in his way. So we saw just days after he won the election, him go after the legacy media. And he largely brought them to heel. I mean, they haven't really been causing him, Brian, much of a fuss ever since.
Right. Yeah.
Right. He then went after the billionaires, and the billionaires all flew their private jets to have dinner with him, hand him checks, and sit on a stage like props at his inaugural. Yeah. And they're not causing him trouble. Then he went after the large law firms, and the large law firms, with a few notable exceptions, a lot of them have been tripping over themselves to pour hundreds of millions of dollars of free legal services at Donald Trump. So much so that, he, I think by last count, now has settled like for $960 billion of free pro bono legal work that he and they have agreed on.
A cool $1 billion sitting there waiting for him to exploit.
Yeah. And, there's an article in the New York Times recently that had, I think, 5 bylines. So it was like quite a thing that said that these law firms are, by the way, taken aback. They're surprised that he now expects them to do work, for example, for the coal industry or on these trade deals, or maybe even to represent people he wants pro bono if they get themselves in trouble. Brian, it's hard to imagine that these powerful lawyers are that naive, but yet here we go with another group. Yeah. And so, it is no surprise that after that, he then went after the universities, and now he's going after his direct opponents. So who are his direct opponents? Well, we've seen him go after a couple of individuals, one who was a former aide of his and one who worked at CISA with executive orders. And so, of course, we are going to see political retribution against Democrats. I mean, like in some sense, you might be surprised he didn't start there. Now, I think he didn't start there because he wanted to first weaken the media, weaken the legal industry, maybe bank some dollars behind him of the legal industry. But now, of course, there's going to be political retribution. I wrote in Democracy Docket 2 months ago an article literally entitled "There Will Be Retribution," because that's what he's built for. So he is now going to work through the parts of his political opposition that he can. We've seen this to some extent with the executive orders targeting elections and independent agencies, where he's trying to assert control in a way that would help him and the Republican Party electorally. But I expect we're going to see more direct action.
Can you speak about the prospect of, as Trump continues to go after these different groups, the fact that if they decide to acquiesce, if they decide to capitulate, that really, A, they're not gaining what they think they're going to gain, because ultimately Trump is going to go back and look for more and more and more. And if you give him an inch, he's going to take a mile, as we've seen from these law firms. And B, more broadly, it emboldens him to know that it is easy to go after all of these different people and companies and entities. And so it's just making the whole ecosystem more broadly all the more endangered by virtue of their actions.
Yeah. So look, I don't think the Democratic organizations, the progressive organizations, are going to capitulate. What I do worry is that either they'll be targeted in ways that will make them much less effective because they'll be tied up with investigations, right, or where some number of them, and not necessarily the two you singled out, but some number of them just tone down their activities. They become less active. They become less confrontational. They, rather than putting out one more press release, they don't. Rather than holding a protest, they decide to do something virtual. In other words, they just pull back from direct confrontation. And that can have the effect of undermining an effective opposition movement. And again, you've seen him do this with other areas of civil society. And I worry about that. I worry particularly in the area of nonprofit organizations that have tax exempt status. I mean, we've seen, Brian, him target the tax exempt status of Harvard University. Well, Harvard University's got an endowment of tens of billions of dollars. These nonprofit organizations that do this progressive work typically don't have those kinds of numbers, or they certainly don't have those numbers. They typically don't have large reserves. And so if he goes after tax exempt status, it can cause real pain for these organizations. And of course, all of this is also a concern because of what it does for the people who are funding these organizations. Like, does it cause concern in the funder community? So look, Trump is going to do all of the above. Okay, this is my message. Like, Trump's doing all of the above. Everything I just mentioned, Donald Trump's going to do. He doesn't need me to tell him the playbook. He understands the playbook. The question, as you point out, is whether we stand up against it or whether we capitulate to it. Do we stand tall and stand together, shoulder to shoulder, and say, we're not going to let you do this, and we are going to continue to fight you no matter what the cost? Or do we start to see some people back away and get quiet and become less outspoken and less effective? And some funders decide that maybe they won't be as active in this space. And if that happens, honestly, then we're just doing the bidding of Donald Trump. We are doing the bidding of the Republican Party. And then we will be in even worse shape than we are if we all stand tall together.
You know, in terms of the legal recourse to something like this, if Trump weren't the president of the United States and we saw somebody, for example, filing frivolous lawsuits or lawsuits meant to chill free speech or whatever, there are, for example, punitive damages that would serve as a deterrent for him to do this in the future. As the president of the United States, with all of the levers of the federal government at his disposal, there aren't really any punitive levers for folks to be able to pull against the government. So, are there? I mean, is there anything that would basically serve as a deterrent for him to continue this scorched earth process where he barrels forward and just tries to take out any opposition in his path?
Yeah, I think the thing that the superpower that people have over Donald Trump is to embarrass him. You know, he went after a bunch of law firms and he has lost every one of those cases. And now, if you notice, what he's really doing is he's just finding firms to settle with him. Like every time they do something and they get sued and they lose, Donald Trump gets angrier and angrier. Pam Bondi, has some outburst. And so, my message to the progressive and democratic organizations is, if he comes after you or if he does something illegal, sue. And then dance on his head when you win. You know what I mean? Humiliate him. Because as you know, Brian, that is for Donald Trump, the humiliation of losing in court is actually a power that people have over him.
Right. And then, of course, I would also note that for folks who are looking to have some type of power over him, not in the legal system, but look, we have seen the ways in which, for example, these marches where we get more people to take to the streets and show that we have the power of actual human beings, that is greater, I think, than anything else that we're seeing, whether it's in the courts, whether it's, the action being taken by Democrats in Congress, whether it's the House or the Senate. Having these marches, having people show that the vast majority of Americans are not standing down, but are perfectly willing to take on this fight. I think that is probably more powerful than all of those other things, even in aggregate. Yeah,
look, the fight for democracy is not one that most of the people watching this video chose. It is not, frankly, the fight that many of the organizations you're talking about chose. In fact, they're, like you point out, they want to raise money, or they want to, make better policy. They want to solve the problems of climate or healthcare for the poor, right? But the fight of democracy is the fight of our time. It is the fight that has come to us, and we cannot shrink away from it. And so whether you are someone being asked to turn out and march, whether you're someone who is chipping in $5 to one of these organizations, whether you lead a progressive organization and you have to decide whether to stand up or to sit down, this is the time in American history, in your life, that you need to show courage. You need to stand tall, you need to stand proud, and you need to fight with everything you've got in opposition to what Donald Trump is trying to do to this country.
Perfectly put. Could not have said that better. And by the way, I should note that one of those organizations that is standing up and engaging in fearless journalism against this administration is Democracy Docket, which is the news outlet you founded to focus on everything voting and elections. Highly recommend for anybody who's watching right now who wants to support the invaluable work that Marc and his team are doing. Please sign up for Democracy Docket. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.